Welcome, everybody. We have Andrea Jones. She's the founder and CEO of the AJC Company. And even more exciting than that, she's going to be one of your speakers at the MHEDA convention coming up in April in Tampa, Florida. Welcome.
Thank you, Sherry. Excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I kind of mentioned, I know you're probably not familiar with our ProMed show. It's the biggest material handling show in North America. It just happened a few weeks ago, and I know a lot of people went to that show, probably took a lot away from it. So even if they're not going to the convention coming up this month, hopefully they can get something from the information we talk about today of how to implement maybe some of those things they saw at this very exciting show. So I always like to start with just sort of setting the table. I think we live in a world that people throw around words a lot and don't really know what they all mean. I do think change management has become one of those words that you hear a lot, but maybe not with a lot of definition behind it. So maybe just to kind of start us off and set the table, could you just say from your perspective what change management is in a business context?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. You're right. Change management has become a bit of a four-letter word, right, in business. So when we talk about change management, we're really talking about the people side of change. Actually, change is experienced by people almost like grief is experienced by people. There's a scientist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who did studies in the 80s about how the people side of change follows a grief pattern. So there's things like denial and despair and frustration and anger and all of these things that happen when somebody first hears about something that's going to change in their world. And when we talk about change management, we need to recognize that it's happening and be able to work with human nature rather than against it. So change management is really talking about the people side of change. It is also a leadership capability. What I mean by that is when leaders understand what people go through and they can recognize these patterns, they become capable of adapting to them using, tools and processes for sure, but it becomes like a habit to follow the process, right? It's just the way they do things. So it's a leadership capability. And then finally, it's an organizational capability. When leaders can demonstrate that they understand the people side of change, they can shepherd their people through, and they have leadership capability, the whole organization will become more mature, and they can then adapt and effect change more rapidly.
That's probably the best explanation I've ever heard. So thank you for that. I think everyone can relate to that. We work in an industry that has seen a lot of change, like many industries have. And I would say, in my experience, I've been in this industry for a long time, but the material handling industry is kind of slower to change, I think, than some other industries tend to be. And they tend to be a little bit smaller. A lot of organizations were mom and pop organizations that have grown through acquisitions over the last 10, 15 years. And so there's a lot of change in that. We've seen ownership change over. We've seen strategy change over. I've seen companies change entire product lines over the last few years. And that's a big deal, especially if you've been working in an organization for a long time. On the other side, I've also seen and been a part of a lot of companies that talked a lot about change, and then nothing really ever happened. There was maybe some big plans and people talked about it, and it got to a point of like, this isn't going to happen, so I don't have to worry about it. And I've seen that at companies I've worked for. I've heard that from other people. So why do you think that some reasons that change initiatives might fail within a company?
Well, I think it's a really good point that perhaps the industry stereotypically is not quick to change. I would give the analogy of driving on the freeway. I live in Florida. People in Florida on the freeway are ridiculously fast drivers. It says 70 and the average speed out there is 80, right? So we don't necessarily have to be going the fastest or the slowest, but we're keeping up with the pace of traffic and maybe leading the edge a little bit, right? So if you're in an industry that overall isn't changing super fast, I wouldn't stress too much about that. I think people think, oh, there's AI, there's this, there's that, we've got to do it right now. And then to your other point, it's a lot of talk because we don't really know what to do. So we end up doing nothing, and then the whole thing passes us by. But it's like maybe we can set ourselves up for incremental change and think of it that way. We don't have to be the fastest one on the freeway, but we're kind of leading maybe the top quartile of the speed, that the actual people are going. So that's one thing to think about with respect to change, and not beat yourself up too much about, are we, really going too fast here to keep up? Then once companies decide to change, back to your original question, which is what are the biggest problems? I think one of the biggest problems is forgetting about the second step in the ADKAR framework. I think we'll get to that, which is desire. The leadership team most likely has been talking about or considering whatever change it is they want to implement for a little while. You mentioned a conference people went to recently. I'm sure they got lots of ideas. Probably leaders were there. They're bringing it back to their organizations. They're having conversations behind, closed doors or in leadership strategic sessions. But the average person doing the work, interfacing with the customer on the day-to-day basis, in customer service, in, at the front desk, sending out invoices, whatever those people are doing, they haven't even heard of this change yet. And so the leaders have been talking about it for however long, and they finally decide they want to do it. They announce it to the company and expect everybody to just jump up and down and be thrilled. But the average person hasn't had any time to absorb it, to really go through that process I mentioned before, the grief process. And so the disconnect between the time leadership has been thinking about a change and the amount of time they give the people that are expected to participate in and behave in a new way, the time to adapt and desire that change is very minimal. And they push too fast, and then it never happens because they haven't gotten people to understand what's in it for them, what's in it for me. That's the with them, right? How do we make sure the majority of our people understand not only what this change is, why the organization is doing it, but also why it's better for them individually? That's the people side of change. And here's a story for that. So I was actually at a conference about a year and a half ago. It was a manufacturing conference here in Florida. A plant manager came up on a panel, and he said they were doing a whole digital transformation. So a new material resource planning system that the floor was expected to use. They weren't going to get printouts for the bill of materials. It was going to be on a handheld, And there was a gentleman that had been at the company for maybe 3 or 4 decades. He had an 18-year-old son. So that's kind of the age range this gentleman was in. And he was being pretty resistant about this change. Didn't want to use the handheld, like the paper printout, wasn't interested at all. And the plant manager was like, So instead of immediately talking about the change, he asked the gentleman about his son. Hey, Joe, how's your son doing? He's 18 now, right? Oh, yeah, he's going to be graduating high school, and, I don't know, he doesn't know what he's going to do with his life. Oh, has he considered a career in manufacturing like you? He's like, oh, he doesn't want to go into manufacturing. He only wants to do things on his screen. He's interested in his phone, his video games. And the guy's like, well, that's very interesting. So you're saying your son doesn't want to go into manufacturing because he thinks it's maybe not technically savvy, we aren't using devices or anything? He's like, yeah. And then the light bulb went on. It's like, well, gosh, that's so interesting because we're trying to become digitally transformed here. We actually want to use these handhelds and these devices. Do you think that might help someone like your son be more interested in manufacturing? And the guy was like, wow, here I am resisting the very thing that someone my son's age knows how to do natively. That was the thing that it took that guy to realize in order to want to change. So back to being very personal, it's hard sometimes to think, how can I go talk to every single human being? And we'll talk about how you can get to that, but it's very personal. People wanting to desire change, they have to feel it in their hearts, It's not always a science.
It's such a great example that I'm sure, especially a lot of my marketing friends and material handling can appreciate. I've worked with salespeople even as recently as a few months ago that did not want to get rid of his Rolodex, his paper Rolodex that I didn't even know you could buy in the store anymore, but apparently you
I
can
thought
still
only antique stores were carrying those.
but I think it's such a good point. I want to stay on it, and that's a great story, and you kind of alluded to it. So you can't do that with every single person. You can't find that personal connection with every person to kind of explain change. So how do you go about getting employee buy-in?
Yeah, thank you for asking. You're right that one leader can't necessarily have the time to talk to every individual in the company. However, every individual has a supervisor, and probably in the organization that supervisor has a manageable number of employees that represent or report to her or him. And so we build change champions through the supervisor network. And the supervisors need to be armed with the messaging, the FAQs, right? And it can kind of waterfall down so that ultimately every individual is having an individual conversation. But it's not with the plant manager necessarily, right? But it's with their supervisor. And if the plant manager happens to walk up and talk to someone, that someone shouldn't be hearing some vastly different message about the rationale for the change or whatever it might be than the supervisor has provided, because you've done a very good job of consistently saying, here's why we're doing this, right? Repeating ourselves, ensuring that that message cascades down, the desire cascades down, and then it also can cascade back up. So the way to affect change to every individual is really through their supervisors. That's who people look to primarily to answer their questions. That's the most influential person on their job. And we have to empower those change champions.
I think that's so important. And a lot of times I've seen at organizations where, to your point, the leadership has been talking about it forever, and then they kind of just spew it out to the masses and don't include that middle management layer in kind of the explanation prior. And that can have such a tremendous benefit. To your point, they have a more personal relationship with their employees. They can explain it in a way that makes sense to them, but they have to be felt like they were brought in on it, before everyone was told. So I think that's a great point. I want to see if we can just shift gears a little bit. So let's say we have this great plan. Leadership has talked about it. They've included middle management. They've talked about it to the employees. They've given them ample amount of time to kind of think about this change. And maybe some have accepted, maybe some haven't. I think where a lot of times things fall apart is in the execution of the plan. So this is what we're going to do, but then the execution tends to not always be effective, or it's a little bit more slow walking. How do you really go about the execution piece of this?
Yes, you are so right. It's like we are all on board and now we have to do something. Here's
Right.
my ambiguity is the enemy of execution. Meaning, when people don't know why they're doing things, we already talked about that. What the most important thing is, number one, what the second most important thing is, number two, however many projects you're trying to get done in a given quarter, that's the cadence most humans naturally fall into. What is expected, and I call this the definition of done, what the definition of done is by the end of the quarter, and who is doing what on the team, who's the sponsor, where there's any escalation questions, this is probably somebody in the leadership team, who is on the team itself, right? It's Joe and it's Sally and it's Sarah and it's Bob, but we don't know, if we aren't sure we're on that team, we're not sure if we're going to participate or not. So you got to call these people out by name. And then a very critical role of the project manager, which does not have to have the title of project manager, but still has to be the glue person keeping that particular project on board. We want to be as clear as possible. Leadership really is responsible for that. So that full clarity to eliminate any ambiguity gets us started with execution. And then the way we talk about it, we use a model that I developed called the Executagility model. Executagility is a 7-syllable, hard to pronounce word, but it plays on executability. So that's why I used it. And it is a very lightweight, straightforward way of getting work done. We do it in 2-week sprint increments. So we say, okay, if the leadership team is super clear and we have given, this is priority 1, 2, 3, here's who is participating in very specific roles as sponsor, core team, project manager. And here's the 3 rationale reasons we're doing this. We need to improve our net promoter score with our customers. We need to increase our operational efficiency, and we need to get net new customers. Maybe those are reasons that you're doing some project right now. Then everyone whose name is on that list is made aware of this through communication. That's the cascade of the supervisors and all of those things. We actually have a little metric people can take to assess whether the message got through. And the sprints get running in 2-week increments. We say, what are we actually going to do in just 2 weeks? Let's not worry about too much longer, because that's where people, I would say the second step, you alluded, what's the first thing that is a disconnect. We talked about the time and the communication. But the second thing is, like you said, people, they feel like it's such a big project. It's ambiguous. We don't really know what to do. And they just stall. But how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. Let's just get started with little tasks, and we can say in 2 weeks we can do these 10 things. And we just track it every day. Can we really do these 10 things? Are we on track? And at the end of 2 weeks, we say, well, we said we were going to do 10. We only got 8, but we did get these 8 things done. We have a little review. That's a great communication tool, keeps everybody aligned on the progress. And then we say, okay, for the next 2 weeks, let's get those last 2 things we didn't get done. And then should we only commit to 8 total, right? Was there a reason we didn't get all 10? Did we overcommit, under deliver? Did we not anticipate something? We try to improve through a retrospective process, and we recommit for 2 more weeks and 2 more weeks and 2 more weeks over the course of the quarter, always marching towards the definition of done. And over time, the organization will get better at this. You know, I had a CEO I spoke with, I guess it was a month or so ago, and he was trying to implement a new payroll software. This is actually a construction company, so it might be a customer of some of our members in MHEDA. He said they wanted to implement this new payroll where everybody on their job sites used their phone to track their hours. Very simple, you would think. It was supposed to have gone live 2 quarters ago. Then it was supposed to have gone live at the end of the previous quarter. Now, when I spoke with him, it was supposed to go live in 6 more weeks at the end of the current quarter. And I said, well, why has it been stalling? What do you think going live and everybody using it, what does that mean? He's like, well, I just want everybody using it. I'm like, okay, so how many people are we talking about here? And he's like, well, there's 40. Okay, 40 people. Could you name every human being? He's like, of course we could. Great. How many projects are we talking about? He's like, oh, well over 100. I'm like, okay, great. So what you're telling me is there's 40 people who are assigned to over 100 projects, and you could map what they're assigned to. Is that right? And he said, yes. And he said, great. How many of those 40 people already have this app downloaded on their phone? And he looks at me and he said, I don't think anybody does. And I said, okay. And has the back end been set up so that the 40 people's names are in the system, this new system you paid for, and all your projects are loaded up in there, and the mapping has been done? He's like, I don't think so. And I said, okay. And what you're telling me then is in the next 6 weeks, you want 40 people to have downloaded an app and got into it and allocated at least 1 hour to every project to which they're assigned, effectively by the end of the quarter. That's what you mean by done. He's like, when you put it that way, that's very specific. And if we know what that means, we can back ourselves from that, and we can just do 2 weeks at a time. Okay, let's get the list of the 40 people. Okay, that's done. Now let's get the list of the 100 projects. Okay, that's done. Okay, let's map the people to the projects. Okay, that's done. Right? Let's upload it all into the new system. Okay, that's done. Let's go talk to 10 people and just get them to download it. Okay, that's done. Let's have them pilot it. Okay, that's done. These little things that slowly set us to the end goal. So it's a long-winded way of saying it's hard to execute when the goals are ambiguous and when you don't get specific about the incremental tasks.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. You made a lot of good points. I just want to circle back on a few. I think the idea of having a project manager and stating that it doesn't have to be called the project manager, because I think we get caught up a lot of times in titles. But going back to just making sure that everybody understands their level of authority and that they do have some level of authority to manage the project is so important, because we're working with organizations that this project manager has other responsibilities too. A lot of companies can't afford just to have a position that's just for implementation of new ideas. Um, and I think when you look at it from the perspective of kind of 2 weeks at a time and small bites at a time, that really is a game changer. And to me, what I see a lot of companies miss is writing down what all of those steps are. The step of get everybody to download the app, the step of add all the things. And to me, having kind of putting pen to paper, having that down and looking at it makes it so much easier to execute, as opposed to thinking about this huge concept that I don't even want to start because there's no way that I'm ever going to get it done. So I think that's some great advice. Kind of going back to the people element of this. The workplace has evolved so much, especially since COVID. It was kind of going the direction it evolved during COVID. Now we're kind of in this, are some people working from home? Some people are. We're kind of in this middle kind of gray area with different companies deciding different things. Um, and I have read a number of articles that are saying really employees are going back to work because they didn't feel the employees had enough connection with the company working from home, and different theories based on that. When you're talking about change management and employees really embracing change, have you seen the evolution of the work environment negatively affect people's ability to create change within an organization?
So what I'm hearing you say is because people are working remotely and disparate and not seeing each other all the time, perhaps they're disconnected from the company and they're not as engaged in any change, or
Yeah.
really maybe even in the company. Um, to me, that's a cultural issue. I have seen companies very connected with employees that are very engaged who are working remote or hybrid. I personally think FaceTime for strategic things and connection is important. It does not have to be every day. That's my personal opinion. I do think it needs to at least be quarterly. I think that's a good idea. Uh, However, I think the takeaway for leaders, independent of if they are allowing people to be hybrid because maybe that's what they want, they don't like their long commute, they feel more productive at home, whatever it might be, is you cannot outsource participating in the change as a leader. And you don't have to be the one tactically doing the upload and all the thing from my example before. However, here's another analogy. Imagine you're throwing a party in your backyard for somebody's graduation or best friend's birthday or whatever, and you've outsourced the invitations, and you've outsourced the catering, and you've outsourced the decorations, right? And you've even outsourced the setup and the cleanup and the serving and all the other things that are happening. If you don't show up to your own party, will anybody believe it was your party? Probably not, right? Leaders have to be the ones communicating. You cannot outsource that messaging. You can have somebody maybe write it for you and copy and paste, but it's got to come out of your email inbox, right? It's got to come out of your mouth, and don't have AI speak it for you. Whether you're doing it virtually, whether you're doing it in person, whether you're doing it sometimes in person and sometimes virtually, I think that will help the culture recognize you're serious about a change. You're not just what flavor of the month, changing your mind every 5 seconds, and they'll be more engaged. So
Yeah.
the trends, you're right, they're there. And I have a lot of personal opinions. I've always had a remote business. I have children at home. It's very helpful to me to not have to drive hours on end in rush hour, right? Um, I think that companies will make their own decisions about that. They can still have effective cultures if the leaders participate and are always there speaking to the company directly.
I completely agree. I think that's a great point. So I want to end on really I know you're going to have a session that's going to give us advice of how to implement change, but what's one piece of advice you can give us that somebody that might be going through their first kind of change management initiative and are in charge of leading it? What's your number one piece of advice for that individual?
Don't skip the wisdom, the what's in it for me. Right? Remembering, like we discussed in the very beginning of this conversation, every person will go through a change differently. It's a sort of a grief curve they're following. Some people are naturally early adopters, they're excited about change and they're ready to do it. Some people are very resistant. Uh, Through your supervisor champion, leveraging and always having consistent messaging and it directly coming from leaders, give people the time. Don't skip finding out what's in it for them and helping all of the people come up with that. It will take you longer than you want it to, guaranteed. But if you get that done, then the rest of the execution will just be mechanical, if that makes sense. If you don't get that done, then people are going to be resistant. They're possibly going to sabotage your change, right? And they're not going to get on board. And you might as well take your money and dump it down a toilet. It's not going to really stick in your organization.
I love that. I think that's great advice. So, I know you might not be familiar with MHEDA Talks, but we do a lightning round at the end of our sessions, and I'm happy to report you have made it to our lightning round. I just want to make sure you're ready to enter it.
Do I have to speak faster? I'll try to
No,
slow
you don't have to speak faster, but they're
down.
quick answers. Like, I'm not timing this, and there's no prize at that. Um,
Okay.
All right. I like to start off with something easy. Which subject were you worst at in school?
English. I was very math oriented, like things have a right answer. And so when you had to write an essay and be super subjective and support it with all this stuff, it was like, huh. that that was my worst subject in school.
Where would you go if you were invisible?
Ooh. Do I have to be able to breathe oxygen?
No?
Because
It
I would
can.
go to space. I would so go to the moon. I'd go to Mars. I'd be like flying around the solar system. I have always been fascinated by space. That's where I go if I could.
What's one item you could never live without?
That's a really good question. I'm assuming you mean a thing, not a person. An
Yeah,
item I
not a,
couldn't live
the
without.
kid, was it like that? You can't cap out on the answer.
Can we say coffee?
Coffee's fair. That's a fair
I
answer.
know I do well without coffee.
Would you rather climb a mountain or jump from a plane?
Climb a mountain, 100%.
Same. What is the most boring thing ever?
People talking and not doing anything.
I cannot agree more. Well, you have made it through our lightning round with flying colors, so thank you for that. Um, if you guys want to hear more, Andrea is doing two sessions at the MHEDA convention. Again, that's coming up April 26th or April 30th in Tampa, Florida. Her two sessions are, first one's entitled I'm Too Busy, How to Execute Growth Initiatives. And the second session is 3 tips for big change. I know I will be attending both of those sessions to learn more from you. This has been such a great conversation. Is there anything you want to leave our listeners with?
I look forward to meeting you and trying to offer as much value as I possibly can in these sessions. And if people want to reach out to me, if they're not going or any other way, you can go to ajccompany.com and contact us from there.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I look forward to meeting you in person, and I look forward to seeing everybody at the MHEDA convention coming up in a few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.